Hello and welcome to another episode of The Corporate Etiquette, a show where we break down the corporate world so you can make better sense of it. My name is Laura, and in today's episode, I want to talk about how you can negotiate your salary during the hiring process to get the most bang for your buck. Make sure that you stay tuned until the end of the video to find out what, in my opinion, is the single biggest asset that you have in order to negotiate a better salary. If I'm being completely honest, negotiating your salary actually starts well before applying for a job. And in my opinion, the first thing that you should do is actually know yourself. Before you start researching the company or you try to find out what their stocks are valued on, you should sit down and review what your current budget is. First and foremost, you need to have a very good understanding about what your non-negotiable expenses are. These include things such as your mortgage or your rent, utilities, internet, car expenses, childcare expenses, and so on. Additionally, you should also mark down what your upcoming investment goals are. How much are you trying to save per year? Are you trying to save for a down payment on a house perhaps, or you're trying to build a college fund for your kid? Similarly, you should also take into consideration what your family situation is or is likely to be developed over the next 2-3 years. For example, if you don't currently have children but you are thinking about starting a family, let's say in the next 1 to 2 years, then this will be another big expense that you should add to your budget. Of course, you should also review any debt that you might have as well as the conditions of repaying that amount of money. Will allow you to go into negotiations and job hunt with a more realistic expectations as to what is the minimum required versus what is a comfortable amount. So right after you brushed up your resume, the next thing you should do immediately is brush up your Excel skills, draft up your budget, and be very honest about your financial situation. The second step that will guarantee you a higher salary when looking for a job is actually gathering information. I'm pretty sure that this is not groundbreaking information. I think most people encourage you to gather information before you start negotiating your salary. As I've mentioned in many videos before, this is a classic Glassdoor moment, and I really feel that at this point in time Glassdoor should start sponsoring me for how much I advertise their services, but it really is a very good website and you should take advantage of it. So when you go on there, first and foremost, you should try to look at what are the salary ranges in that particular company that you're applying for. Additionally, you should go through the answers for similar positions to try to understand what people are getting as initial offers. Of course, most of the time, and especially on bigger companies, the salary is actually on a range, it's not just one number. And your goal here is to understand what that range is. With that information in mind, you can later try to assess the offer that you receive to understand if you're middle of the band, top of the band, or a lot lower in the band. Another very important piece of information that I think is often overlooked is trying to understand what the average annual increase in salary actually is. For example, if people are complaining that their annual increase is in the lower single digits, then perhaps you need to negotiate your salary as if you're never getting an increase ever again. Another thing that you should try to understand, for example, is what is the specific model of compensation that that company usually gives out? Do they give a big cash bonus in the beginning? Is the vesting schedule equal across a number of years, or is it prorated perhaps? And here's another tip when trying to understand your total compensation. Definitely look up what type of tax rate is applicable to all components of your total compensation. And here I can actually give you a personal example. When I lived in Luxembourg and I worked at Amazon, my salary was taxed at a lower rate than my shares. This is because, according to the country's law, the shares were actually considered a bonus, so they actually had the highest taxable rate possible. And while it was most definitely very painful when all of my shares vested, it was something that I couldn't influence and I also didn't know beforehand. So learn from my mistakes and figure out what tax rate applies to shares, what tax rate applies to bonuses, and what tax rate applies to your salary as well. Of course, if you're applying to a startup, this probably does not actually apply, but you should be more interested in figuring out what the current valuation of the company is, what is it based on, what investors are putting money into the startup, what round of funding the company is in, as well as are they going to give you shares or options to buy shares. So let's move on to my third tip, which is do not state your number. A lot of times when you're first engaging with a recruiter, perhaps in the very first phone call that you have with them, they're going to ask you what your number is. It's a trap. don't say the number. Instead, try to ask them what their budget is for that role or what the salary range is for that particular role, and then suggest that you should discuss an actual number after you've gone through all of the interviews. Because let's be realistic, if you're going to quote them a lower number than they were expecting or something that is in the lower part of the band, it's going to be actually very difficult to climb out of that once you're done with the interviews. The fourth tip that I have for you is actually to try to negotiate your total compensation, not each component at a time. Odds are, if you're trying to negotiate your shares and then your salary and then your bonuses and then your benefits, you're actually going to end up a lot worse off than if you're trying to focus on one big number and then discussing how that will be split up between various components of your total compensation. However, I don't want you to disconsider what the composition of your total compensation is. And what I mean by this is you should try to understand what portion of it is actually from stocks or shares and how much of these are you getting per year. And I want to stress this again, you should understand how many you are getting per year, not over the vesting schedule of whatever shares they give you. This way you can actually estimate if your liquid money, your cash, can actually cover your non-negotiable expenses, or you will actually need to sell stocks on a regular basis in order to cover whatever expenses you might have. You should also consider how much of your personal wealth is coming from unvested or unsold stocks, because a lot of banks actually don't take them into consideration when, for example, trying to calculate how much mortgage you can take out. This is why I was encouraging you in the beginning to understand your financial situation and your plans before you go into negotiating your total compensation. Not to mention, if more than 10% of your wealth is tied to one company's stocks, that might be a risky position and you might want to consider diversifying at least a little bit. The fifth advice that I can give you in order to negotiate a higher salary is actually to use new information in order to prompt a response from your recruiter. I think this is especially important for larger corporations where, truthfully, compensation is often very formulaic and your recruiter might not actually have a lot of influence on what the final number is. They might need to go back and forth with the committee in order to get approvals to give you a higher salary. Since this is a lot of work, I think we should make it worth their while to go back and ask for more. And the way you can do that is actually using at least 3 pieces of information that you gather along the way. The first piece of information that you can use is actually competing offers from different companies. Most of us, when applying for jobs, are not applying to one company at a time. We're actually applying to, well, multiple different companies. So for example, if a company where you're not really interested in working came to you with a very good offer, you can take that and try to renegotiate your salary at a company you're much more excited to join. And here's a pro tip. If they're asking to see these offers in writing, just know that that is a load of bull. You do not have to show any sort of paper reflecting your offers in order to use them in negotiation. So definitely push back on this request. The second type of information that you can use is actually your offer to stay with your current company. It is an unfortunate reality that we live in that some companies simply don't appreciate their employees until, well, they're on their way out. So it may just happen that when you give your resignation or you're telling your manager that you're going to quit, they're going to ask you, what can we give you to stay? If they're giving you a very generous offer, you can definitely take that number back to your recruiter and ask them to match the compensation that you would get to stay. However, let me offer a disclaimer here. If over the course of the interviews you slipped up a little bit and mentioned that you are leaving your company because, oh gosh darn it, it's just such a horrible place to work at, trying to use your offer to stay to negotiate might seem a little bit dodgy. I'm not saying don't try, but you might not get what you want. The third type of information that you should try to use in order to get a better salary is actually information that you find out during the interview. For example, if you find out in talking to people that they actually didn't list all of the responsibilities that that role might have, and it's actually a lot more senior than they advertised, definitely use that in order to get a higher salaries. Your compensation should reflect the work that you do for the company, so don't be embarrassed to ask for more money if you figure out that actually you're gonna have to do a lot more work than initially advertised. And lastly, tied to what I said previously, you should also listen to the feedback that you've gotten from the interviewers in order to understand if you can do anything to up that number. You should definitely ask the recruiter if they can share the feedback from the interviews with you. This way, if you see that the interviewers have any sort of concerns related to your application, you can try to give more proof or dispel those in order to convince them that you are in fact a good hire. That way, they'll be more comfortable making you a bigger offer. And lastly, as I advertised at the beginning of this video, let me tell you what, in my opinion, is the biggest asset and the biggest quality that you have that you can use in order to increase the offer that you get. And that is your ability to walk away from the job. Assuming all of the interviews went well, everybody liked you, you liked everybody, everybody's super happy, well, then it's time to close. Also, your recruiter will go from trying to recruit you and assess you to trying to close on that particular job. Assuming that you did all your research, you know what you were asking for, you used all of the information during the interviews and counter offers, but you still didn't manage to get a higher salary, the only other ace up your sleeve is actually your ability and your willingness to walk away from that job. It might sound simple, it might sound perhaps counterintuitive, but it is something that I have seen worked in practice. It's definitely scary, and I don't recommend that you take this decision lightly. You should definitely consider, from the information that you have, are you at the top of the salary band? As well as consider why you are applying for that job. Is it to improve your work-life balance? Well, if you're going from a high-stress FANG type of company to a more chilled startup, then perhaps the salary is going to be lower, but what you get in return is better work-life balance. I know. You're trying to optimize on all fronts. You want the work-life balance and the high salary and the perks and the benefits, but ultimately, you will have to sacrifice something, so definitely understand what is important to you in this moment. And of course, is it worth walking away from a job because the salary is not so high when you're actually trying to optimize for time off, for example? Another thing that I want to stress here is don't use this as a threat, right? You need to be cooperative. You need to work with your recruiter, preferably over the phone, not over email. I will also say this. You need to be cooperative, you need to be thankful, and you need to work with your recruiter. Assume that they also want to hire you. You did well in the interviews so far. That being said, if you've definitely analyzed your situation and you think that walking away is the right choice here in order to see if you can get a bigger salary, here's how I would go about it. First of all, thank your recruiter and reinforce your enthusiasm. Tell them it was great meeting everybody, the job sounds so interesting, it's really exactly what you're looking for, and you think you would be a good fit. Thank them for the work that they did to try to recruit you and mention that it was lovely working with them. And then politely go into refusing the offer, mentioning something along the lines of, while this is a great opportunity, I simply cannot accept this total compensation. The number is just too low. Now, I will say at this point in time, it might be good to actually have a number in mind as to what would get you to accept the job. The recruiter might also ask you what your expected number is, but you can also go back to the back and forth dance of tell me how much more you can get and I'll tell you if I accept it. Negotiation as well as compensation are not actually exact sciences, so outcomes may vary. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't advocate for yourself and for your financial stability. It's definitely hard, and I'm by no means an expert in negotiating my salary. I've done my fair share of mistakes. But ultimately, if you're not going to advocate for your total compensation, nobody will. So you have to do it no matter how hard it may seem. Give this video a thumbs up if you found it useful. And if you want to keep up with me and all of my other videos on how the corporate world works, then click subscribe and ring that bell so you get notified every time I put out a new video. That's it for now. Have a good one.